Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us as we begin RespectAbility's fourth installment of our 8-part webinar series, including people with disabilities in philanthropy and nonprofits. I am Randall Duchesneau and I serve on RespectAbility's Board of Advisors. I'm going to kick off today's webinar about how to recruit, accommodate, and promote people with disabilities for paid employment, volunteer leadership, and board positions. After the presentation, the PowerPoint will be available on the website. Next slide. Before we begin, RespectAbility would like to thank all 18 of our Equity and Access Series partners that are listed on this slide. We thank you for your help in promoting this series. We have about 500 registered participants for today's webinar, and we're thankful for each and every one of you as well. Next slide. We know that organizations are at their best when they welcome, respect, and include people of all backgrounds. This includes people with disabilities. Next slide. People with disabilities can be extremely successful if given the right accommodations and support. Stephen Hawking, Whoopi Goldberg, Richard Branson, Demi Lovato, and Steve Jobs, to name a few of the people pictured on this slide, are all people with disabilities. Next slide. 61 million people in the United States have a disability, which is 1 in 5 Americans. They want to work, succeed, and reach their full potential just like anyone else. Next slide. 1 in 4 adults have a disability, and it's especially important as people with disability age. They have the proper supports and services in place to live and thrive. Next slide. Disabilities can be temporary or permanent. They can be invisible or visible, and they can be acquired at birth or later in life. It's important to note that any person can join the disability community at any time. Next slide. So now I'll introduce the 2 fabulous speakers we have joining me today. Today's speakers are Emily Harris and Risa Rifkind. Emily Harris is the principal of Harris Strategies, LLC, helping nonprofit organizations, philanthropy, and public agencies move their ideas into action. She was the founding executive director of ADA 25, Advancing Leadership. Risa Rifkind oversees Advancing Leadership's Civic Connections project by engaging with members and partners to identify opportunities for members to lead with power and influence. She leads Advancing Leadership's external and internal marketing, communications, and outreach. If you come up with any questions for either of our speakers, please type them into the Q&A box and we will answer them later on in this webinar. Now, I would like to turn it over to Emily and Risa. Take it away.
Thank you, Randy. This is Emily, and I will get us started. Can I have the next slide, please? I want to make sure, in addition to feeling free to raise questions at any time, to let you know that if you have any access issues, including with the closed captions that are available, feel free to ask questions in the chat box. The staff will take care of that. So I wanted to say a little more about me and Risa. We've worked together for the past 5 years on Advancing Leadership, and she'll tell you a little more about that. And I also wanted to say a little more about disabilities and my own disability, because one of the things to keep in mind is that you may not even know that you have people with disabilities working in your organizations already. And those of us with disabilities may not even know it ourselves. For example, 5 years ago, I really didn't think of myself as having a disability, although I've had hearing loss for more than 20 years. I learned about being part of the disability community when I had the privilege to organize ADA 25 Chicago, a celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And over those 5 years since I started that initiative, and then developed and led Advancing Leadership, I really learned what self-identifying can mean to me in terms of not only being part of an incredible community, learning to advocate for myself and feeling empowered because of that. So keep in mind that as you go down this journey, you may discover that people who you didn't know have disabilities and who maybe even didn't know about their opportunities to self-identify may be coming forward. Our experience is primarily engaging people with disabilities in volunteer roles on boards, committees, commissions, but as staff members and people with disabilities who have hired and supervised others, we have employment expertise to some extent, but we wanted to be very sure to say before we start this presentation in any detail that we will address employment basics, but we are not attorneys, we are not HR professionals. So we'll be referring you to other resources and also to the final webinar in the RespectAbility series, which does deal with some of the legal issues. I'm going to pass the mic to Risa now to talk a little bit more about herself and advancing leadership.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. I'm Risa. Pleasure joining you today. As Emily said, we are both people with disabilities too. You know, I've known I had a disability since birth. If one can know anything at birth, I did. And at work, for advancing leadership, my role is to really look at opportunities for our members to lead with power and influence. Our vision is that people with disabilities will lead with power and influence in leadership positions, whether they be on boards of nonprofits, public service boards or commissions on a local, city, state level, in their professional careers and more. 8025 Advancing Leadership is also really proud to say all 4 of our small team, we all also self-identify as having a disability as well. And we are diverse in our disabilities too, from visible, invisible, and acquired disabilities. So for today though, knowing what we do in advancing leadership and as a person with a disability myself, that's kind of the perspective that we will be bringing to this presentation in terms of what recruitment and identification of leaders with disabilities looks like for us and our personal experience. So with that, let's go ahead to the next slide, please. So disability inclusion at your organization can look like a number of opportunities, from volunteer, which is kind of where we focus in terms of leadership roles, like on boards and committees, as I said. But it can also include volunteers who, for internships, for part-time roles, and then of course, disability inclusion should also include staffing from a competitive, integrated lens, meaning that people with disabilities are working alongside people without disabilities and are paid commensurate to their experience and expertise. And we look at advancing leadership at recruitment of our members for these opportunities very intentionally. And we'll talk more about what that looks like, but we look at inclusion intentionally all the way from recruitment identification through selection and inclusion into our network, which would also, for an employment lens, include the hiring and promotion and retention of employees with disabilities. We know that also for another pipeline for staffing, volunteer roles could also be a pipeline. And then for us, we help our members make those connections. Next slide, please. So why are we committed to this? Well, we're committed for a number of reasons. but including the fact that we know that people with disabilities is an untapped talent pool. People with disabilities are unemployed and underemployed at higher rates than people without disabilities. And we know, though, when we are diverse in our staffing, in our leadership roles, we can be more innovative. We are greater together. So the intentional inclusion of people with disabilities in these various roles could potentially increase productivity and also lead to other kind of benefits. What we also know is that people with disabilities have multiple identities. For example, I am a person with a disability, but I'm also a woman of color. So we need to know what our region for us, and on the slide says know your customers, what your customers look like. And you want your staff and your leadership to reflect the diversity of those customers and for us, our region. And we know that when we, Emily and I will share stories in a moment of what it looks like for us, but when we walk into leadership roles, we bring our full selves, including the disability lens, meaning that for us, we are constantly thinking of our identity as someone with a disability and whether or not our programs, our opportunities are accessible to us and to others. So Emily, do you want to share an example of what this looks like for you?
So I sit on a number of boards, one of which is the Leadership Greater Chicago Fellows Association board. And I'm there for a number of reasons. I represent my class from a leadership cohort from a number of years ago. I bring my perspective from my career in urban planning, economic development, and disability inclusion. But also with my presence and my request for accommodation, which is that everybody use a microphone when they're speaking in a group that's larger than about 15 people. It is a reminder continually, even if I'm not bringing that disability inclusion statement myself, to think about how people with disabilities are part of everything that Leadership Greater Chicago does. So I try to bring a disability lens actively in asking questions and making sure that the disability community is consulted, included, that presentations are made to places where people with disabilities are. But I also don't bring knowledge of every disability, but I do find that just by virtue of being in the room and having self-identified, it raises awareness in the group of how people might be conscious of accommodating. And I'll pass this back to Risa.
Thanks, Emily. This is Risa. Like Emily said too, from my experience, I serve on the board and steering committee of an organization in Chicago called the Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium, CCAC for short, which looks to empower cultural organizations to be more accessible to visitors with disabilities. And by virtue of the fact, like Emily said, of being on the board and being in that room, I'm able to ask questions like, are we thinking about making sure that the entrance is accessible to wheelchair users or scooter users like myself? Are we thinking about seating throughout the museum, for example, so that I can too sit down and enjoy a visiting exhibition or the like? So it's being able to be at those tables and ask those questions that are so valuable. Next slide, please. I know that this was said in the beginning of the presentation as well, that people with disabilities can have disabilities that are visible, invisible, acquired, and more. And so we wanted to make sure that you kind of put context around what we mean when we talk about disability. And on the slide now is a long legal definition of disability as outlined by the Americans with Disabilities Act. But just a reminder that neither Emily nor myself are attorneys, so this is from the non-attorney point of view. But the definition is broad because it was aiming to be as inclusive as possible so that the most amount of people have protection and can't be discriminated against. Whether they have a disability or people think that they have a disability. And, you know, it's really empowering, we think, to be able to use the word disability and be intentional about our language choices so that this broad definition, and when we say, do you identify as having a disability to join our network, people are like, yes, I do. And it has a sense of belonging when we also add language, like at the bottom of the slide, that says visible, invisible, or acquired. Because sometimes people don't realize that they can acquire a disability later in life, which I think Randy said in the beginning too, as our population is aging. We're also seeing more of that as well. Disabilities can change at any time related to acquired disabilities, but it can also change. For example, for me, who I have a disability, but as I get older, I'm not old yet, but as I get older, my disability is looking different from 10 years ago to now. And that will be something that we'll highlight in a second when we talk about accommodation. Next slide, please. So what is a reasonable accommodation? This is also from, again, a non-legal perspective, but a reasonable accommodation is something that allows us to do our job. That could look different for a wide variety of people with disabilities. It could be something physical, like the thing I'll describe in a moment. It could be a computer software. It could be adjusted schedules and more. So it really looks different for everyone, and sometimes those things change. A best practice for looking at how to support accommodation financially, even though we know that most accommodations come with a one-time less than $500 cost usually, but a best practice to support the financial obligations of an accommodation is to budget centrally within an organization. This means that any one department is not responsible for meeting those costs, so that it's a shared responsibility and pool of money that anyone in a company organization can access at any time. We found that to be helpful for us personally, but also have heard from others that it kind of removes a financial barrier that an organization might perceive, and then also planning ahead so that budget line is in every budget annually. So I'm going to quickly describe an accommodation that I have, and Emily will do the same. But like I said, my disability, which is dwarfism, has changed the way I work. So at first, I only needed a stool under my desk so that my feet weren't hanging in the air. But now, as time goes on, I'm needing more support. So now I have a custom chair with cushions with a built-in step stool. Emily, would you like to share an accommodation?
As I mentioned, my primary accommodation is to ask that microphones be used in meetings, which are in large echoey rooms. And I've started asking that as an accommodation after going to many, many events that do not use microphones. And what I've learned is, especially in the workplace, it's something that requires many people to participate in my accommodation. And they may not think of it as an accommodation. They usually, it's surprising how many people find it challenging to use a microphone properly. They're often, instead of holding the mic right up to their face, they may hold it to the side or down at their lap. I can't tell you how many times people say, oh, I don't need a microphone, I have a loud voice. And I have to step up and say, you may not need it, but I do, because it amplifies your voice in a way that my hearing aids can amplify much more effectively. The other accommodation I use, if a facility has it, is if they have what's called an induction loop or a hearing loop. And then finally, I guess an accommodation that I've used, not for my primary disability, is that I have carpal tunnel syndrome. So I always request a keyboard tray in my desk setup. That's a great example of requesting an accommodation that I didn't even know I was requesting as an accommodation, because it's a more standard item that many people request. And when I first asked for one, I didn't know anything about the ADA. I just said, my wrist hurt if I don't have this. So another thing just to mention about the microphone piece is that even when I can hear in a large meeting without a microphone, it's a lot more work. So having that microphone available to me has made me much more productive. And Risa, I will float things back to you.
Thanks, Emily. This is Risa. We just threw a lot of information out there, but luckily there's a ton of great resources. We encourage everyone to seek guidance should any questions ever come up, whether you are the employer or the employee. So if we go to the next slide, there is a list of some of the top employment resources that are available. And these resources do also include kind of recommendations for how to set up the process to request accommodations as well. So one of the top ones that I've used, and I've encouraged friends to use as well, is askjan.org. They have a live chat feature, and this is great for employers, employees alike. There's also the Employer Assistance and Resource Network, and then business-to-business organizations like Disability and national organizations on disability. And then, of course, RespectAbility, the host of the webinar. But then there are local resources to wherever you are in the U.S. of ADA centers that are federally funded and technical assistance resource centers, and your protection and advocacy organizations locally that are law firms and that can provide legal guidance. So we encourage you to check these out and use them, because they are great. Next slide, please.
This is Emily. So we've just spent a lot of time on accommodations, and that's because accommodations are really at the heart of making the world accessible for people with disabilities. This is, you know, I remember when I first started this work, somebody sitting down and saying, you know, we're all being accommodated at any time. And disability accommodations are similar to other accommodations that we make, such as how we speak, if we translate something into a different language, if we even act to move a chair around so that somebody can be more comfortable in our office. Really what accommodations are about is making the world more accessible to everyone, so that, for example, as one of my friends who's a wheelchair user said, it's not that her wheelchair is too wide to get into the room, it's that the doorway is too narrow. And I say that because I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about what makes your organization welcoming to people with disabilities. And for people who self-identify with disabilities, or even who are not broadcasting that, just the fact of your telling people that you do offer accommodations and inviting people to let you know what accommodations they need to be most productive is a very strong signal that you are a disability welcoming organization. So whether you are looking to have somebody on your board or introduce more diversity to your staff through disability hiring, showing that you care by broadly and in every place you can, mentioning that people are welcome to let you know what accommodations they need is a very strong signal. Of course, having clearly physically accessible workplaces, event spaces, making sure that your websites are accessible, making sure that materials are accessible. And I believe there have been a number of other webinars and will be other webinars that will get into more detail about how to do all of that. So I encourage you to, if you haven't participated, check out the RespectAbility webinar series, some of which are archived, on how to implement these practices and make your organization the kind of place that people with disabilities want to serve on both the staff and the board. Including accommodation language on every document, on your website, on every invitation to an event, very strong signal. Also making sure that the word disability is included in diversity statements. I got into a conversation yesterday about the whole issue of saying the word. There's actually a hashtag, say the word, because the disability community embraces the word disability. And as you heard in one of the other webinars, there are a variety of ways to use language to embrace disability. Using person-first language is often the sort of more universally acceptable. People in the disability community are now using identity-first language as well. So don't be afraid necessarily to use the word disabled. I am a disabled woman. I am also a woman with a disability. I'm comfortable with both. But most important, making sure that the word disability appears in your diversity statement is a strong signal. And don't feel that using words that are euphemisms in your diversity statement is useful. It's not a matter of respecting all abilities. You're not really worried in your diversity statement about whether I have a math ability or a reading ability or a writing ability. You're talking about the disability community as a part of diversity. So use the word disability. It's defined in law, as you saw. Also, I mentioned inviting board and event attendees to request accommodations. Make sure in your hiring process that you're also including information about how to request accommodations. You can, it's ideal for all of these cases to give an email, a phone number, and a specific person's name that somebody can reach out to. I know that in some cases, and I've just been through a hiring process, that there are deluges of applicants, and HR people may be concerned about giving out a name if they don't want to receive multiple phone calls. A workaround that we've used is to say, call the HR department at this phone number and have a voicemail set up. And the voicemail says that only calls regarding accommodations will be returned. So that should allay your HR concerns of being deluged with phone calls. But in general, best practice is to actually include a person's name, and that signals to the disability community that they're not just going to get some auto response, that they actually can access somebody to discuss and describe exactly what accommodations they need in order to, and if we're talking about the hiring process, but this could be true for board applications as well, somebody may need assistance in actually completing the application. So that's why it's important to have that information right up front, even before you get to the application. They may need assistance in an interview setting, and they may need assistance once they do the work. If they don't need an accommodation in order to be interviewed and get to the hiring stage, people may not choose to disclose until they actually need to request an accommodation at work, and the law protects their ability to wait to disclose until it's most advantageous to them. And I would encourage you to consult legal advice and HR advice about what's okay to ask and what isn't okay to ask in some of those contexts. The other thing that I wanted to mention is training. Very important to make sure that when you do your staff training and your board training, that you include disability in your diversity and inclusion training. So very often people who train on, for instance, racial equity, racial diversity may not be qualified or be comfortable with training on disability inclusion. So important to make sure that you integrate the full range of diversity when you're doing that kind of training. And also remembering that it's not, if you're a larger organization, it's not only the human resources staff who need to be trained, but hiring managers and actually staff who will be interacting with their colleagues. Next slide, please. So stepping back to the volunteer experience, looking at committee and board members, as Risa mentioned, that has really been the sweet spot of advancing leadership. And we've found that many organizations really are looking for this new dimension of diversity and recognizing that they have not included it. Just like with any other board recruitment, you want to be specific and careful about thinking about who you're looking for and why you're looking for them. So we all know that time, talent, and treasure are the three major contributions of board members. I like to add perspective, and that may be part of the talent, but remembering that every board member you bring, especially if you're incorporating new diversity into your organization, will bring a new lens, and that can be invaluable in making your organization both responsive and innovative, as Risa mentioned before. You want to think about why people are serving, and if you've decided that you want to expand your diversity and have somebody with a disability on your board, remember that not every person with a disability is necessarily a disability advocate. So you may find somebody who is an attorney, who is blind and has very little knowledge of disability law or disability community because that person is a real estate attorney. You may find many people with many diverse perspectives. Also remember that disability itself is diverse and that disability intersects with every other identity, as Risa mentioned. So you're not going to find somebody who represents all disabilities, and you really need to think through in your recruitment efforts, are you looking specifically for somebody who understands disability advocacy and issues? Are you looking for somebody who understands another particular area of expertise and just happens to have a disability? And to what extent are those people intersecting? To what extent are they self-disclosing? To what extent are they advocating for themselves? So just important to make sure that you are intentional about all of those things. Secondly, as we mentioned, very important to think about training, and when you do your board diversity training, to incorporate disability into it. And finally, when you're planning board meetings, to recognize that offering accommodations and trying to universally design your meeting is actually usually a series of best practices for really good meetings. So some of the key things you want to do, as I mentioned, my favorite thing to mention is remembering microphones, live captioning, especially if you're going to be including videos, is critical and maybe a requested accommodation, but I'd encourage you to even think about doing this for larger meetings. I know there's an expense to it, but it can be extremely helpful for people sitting in the back of the room, for people who are trying to tweet and want to capture keywords, and also because you get a transcript at the end if you request one. So there's a lot of great reasons to have captioning, but not absolutely required. Another accommodation that many people will request is to have materials in advance. And that's particularly difficult in this day and age when we forget about when our technology enables us to put a PowerPoint together at midnight the night before. I know how many board meetings I do that for. Best practice is to send things out in advance, give people who are in need of those materials time to review them, time to use them with screen reader or other technology. And that's a great discipline to have to make a meeting a good thing. Another great thing that I was trying to model, I think I'm forgetting, is to say your name before you speak. For people who may be blind or low vision, that can be very helpful. It also can be extremely helpful for anybody joining your meeting by conference call, which happens more and more. So some of those pieces are really helpful. Also thinking about materials that you may, or techniques that you may use in your meetings, like PowerPoint, easels, and flip charts may be critical to think about how you can make them available universally. So one example is in our leadership training retreats, where we've had facilitators who find it very useful to use chart paper on an easel to record what's happening in the room. We also have somebody in the back of the room transcribing on a Google Doc, which can be shared with our participants so that everybody has access in real time to the information being shared. Sometimes facilitators or a staff member can use the Google Doc and project it instead of using an easel. So lots of opportunities to think about how you can universally design your meeting and turn it into an even better meeting for everybody. The other thing to remember is there may be specific accommodations that you need to incorporate for specific individuals. Next slide, please. So I want to move from board to staff. This photo is from a roundtable that Advancing Leadership had a number of years ago with HR and other staff at large organizations, including corporations and larger nonprofits, with members of Advancing Leadership to talk about what it's like to be an employee with a disability. And it was kind of an opportunity to have that conversation outside of the employment context, which allowed people a lot of opportunity to really ask questions that they might not ask in other contexts. So some of the things that that group talked about are what I want to talk about on that this slide. One is to remember that employees with disabilities may choose not to disclose, and that's usually because of stigma and because, frankly, we've all grown up being told if you don't need to tell somebody, don't. And of course, under the law, people have the right not to disclose and not to be asked. So remember that as you make your organization more inclusive, you may be pleasantly surprised that there are employees who have not previously disclosed who do disclose, and in turn, when you start to offer them accommodations, you may find that they are even more productive than before. Also, because of the low employment rate of people with disabilities, I want to highlight that when you're reviewing applications, you want to make sure that you focus on skills. We're not ever asking that people with disabilities who are not qualified for a job be considered for that job, but recognize that the path may not be exactly the same as what you often see. So if you're trying to create more diversity in your workplace, you may need to recognize non-traditional backgrounds. Now that's going to be less of a problem for nonprofits because, frankly, given the low employment rate of people with disabilities, many of us do find employment in nonprofits. So you may find people with great experience. But I do often tell people working in corporate settings that recognizing, for example, nonprofit background and the kinds of skills somebody would bring is important. But also recognizing the same way you would with a parent who is returning to work, that people with disabilities may have been working in community settings, may have some time off for medical issues, and those may be pieces of a resume that you want to look at a little more broadly than you often do. And again, I think I've said it many times, but remember when you're hiring staff that you want to think about training the hiring managers and just to overall make sure that your organizational culture is a welcoming culture so that every employee recognizes disability as a natural part of the human experience and something that we all can experience at any time, something that can be temporary or long-term, and something that touches all of us. At this meeting, one of the things that people with disabilities asked was why employers didn't ask them what they needed. And so that can be accommodations generally. It also can be in terms of what is best for the whole staff. So remember to include that in your thinking. Next slide, please. As you think about expanding the participation of people with disabilities in your organization, you want to overcome what every diversity and inclusion professional hates to hear, which is, we can't find them. So your first step on your inclusion journey is really finding people with disabilities, from interns to emerging professionals to professionals who can meet your specific needs. And in order to do that, you want to get to know people where they are. You want to build relationships that are genuine in the community and build a pipeline by seeking disability community partnerships. You can attend events and do proactive outreach. And I'm going to flip the mic to Risa now to talk a little bit about some of the recruitment that she's done in the last couple of years for ADA 25 Advancing Leadership as a great example of how to do outreach in the community.
Thanks, Emily. This is Risa. So for our recruitment for Advancing Leadership, we are looking for emerging leaders with disabilities, established leaders with disabilities, and we look for them, we recruit them from a number of different ways. Like Emily said, we build great partnerships, strong partnerships with other community organizations that focus on and serve people with disabilities. So Centers for Independent Living, for example. Locally, we have Access Living, we have Progress Center for Independent Living, we have RAMP in Joliet, and others. So we maintain and create those relationships by supporting each other and showing up for each other. We also look for other community pillar organizations. So people with disabilities are everywhere. We know that statistically. So they live and they work in communities that may or may not be frequenting the disability service organization. So we want our members' networks to be diverse, like our region. So we make an effort to go to the 7-county region locally and find local organizations in each community to partner with, to build relationships with, to talk about how they in their community are talking about disability and see where we might partner and fit together to do that. And really looking at what our goals are around civic engagement. We look for areas and communities that are looking at civic engagement already, because we know people with disabilities will probably be there as well, because statistically we are everywhere, right? So we look to build those that in-person connection, because we also do digital strategies, but nothing works as well as person to person. So making those familiar connections has been really helpful. We're learning and growing every year, but this year we did a lot of community events that partnered with other events that were already happening that had good attendance, and then we were lucky enough to be invited to join those opportunities. So it takes time, it takes effort, but it's really interesting and amazing to see what that in-person connection can do. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we gave you a ton of information today, but there are a few steps that we hope everyone will take today to either start or continue on the disability inclusion journey. And I know this also connects to one question in the chat of how do you communicate how to provide accommodation and self-disclosure. Well, Emily shared it's really important, one, to say the word disability. It's a strong signal. So you're already opening up that invitation and for engagement on that conversation, engagement of someone who identifies as having a disability. And then two, by saying the word and putting out there how to request accommodations, it's doing that, it's reinforcing that idea. So we, consistently provide ways to request accommodations, and also what might already be in your office, in your space, whether it's a hearing loop, the accessibility of your building or other. And then again, training. Training is something that can be planned for, budgeted for now, for the future, and really looking at training the entire organization, so that it's an organizational cultural shift. Next slide, please. And then don't forget about those upcoming webinars to continue that journey. And to start the wrap up, we also want to quickly mention that unleashing the untapped potential of people with disabilities in employment and leadership roles also has to do with retention and promotion. We often talk about employment, recruitment, but we don't talk enough about what that means once we are hired, once we are in leadership roles on the board, what then? Because we should be thinking about promotion as well. I want to move up in my career. People with disabilities want to be able to move up and be promoted like everyone else in the workforce. We bring a lot of skills to boards that we talked about through the disability lens that include problem solving, productivity, and more. And we're going to go ahead and close out with one of the very famous mantras of nothing about us without us, which really means that we can't talk about disability without including people with disabilities in those conversations. And what those conversations are should be general, because people with disabilities are part of many facets, all facets of our community. I think that's it for us. And if Emily, you don't have anything else to add, I'm going to hand it back over to Randy or Eric.
It's Eric speaking. First of all, thank you so much, Risa and Emily. We really appreciated all the insight that you gave all of us today. So we have some contact information on the slide here, and again, all of these slides will be posted to RespectAbility's website pretty quickly after this presentation ends. And the whole recording of a webinar should be up next week, depending on when we can get the captions edited and put into the video. So here's some contact information. You can learn more about ADA's Advancing Leadership and contact information for our speakers at the links below. We have we have 4 more webinars left in the series. So we're officially at the halfway mark. And so we have 4 more to go, starting with one next week on inclusive storytelling and ensuring a welcoming lexicon. This should be very interesting. So you can find more of the webinars and sign up for all of them at the website at the bottom of your screen. And these last two slides are some more resources that Emily and Risa gave us, and you will be able to look at them on the slideshow after this presentation ends. So I'm going to look for the Q&A and see if there's any questions. And if you have any questions, we have about 7 minutes left. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A box. We'd love to answer any questions that you have. So one question from Jacqueline is, when it comes to accommodations, what is the best way to discuss a job coach to an employer and have them open to the idea of having a job coach go into assistant training?
So this is Emily. Risa and I were just chatting offline about the fact that we haven't experienced this directly ourselves, but I think the basic bottom line is that it's just explaining that having a job coach is an accommodation, and it's the law to provide accommodations, reasonable accommodations. So I think it's probably explaining that a job coach can be extremely helpful in the training process. And I would, if you have further questions about that, check in with some of the resources that we shared on the PowerPoint, whether it's Ask Jan or some of the Disability In or some of the other employment organizations.
So Adam asks, I think I understand the preferred way to offer accommodations beyond simply being positive and inclusive about disability is to communicate openness to provide them. Is there a good online list to say, here are accommodations, let us know if you need any of these or anything else? Or is that not a preferred way to do it?
Risa, do you want to take that?
Sure, I'll try, and please jump in. So this is Risa. I'm trying to remember, there is a list, I believe it's on Ask Jan, of accommodation as examples. And it's clearly not an exhaustive list because, like I said, it could be a number of different types of accommodations depending upon an individual and their unique disability and need to do their job. So, you know, I think it's for your knowledge to look at the list, but listing accommodations would be difficult. However, if you're doing an event, for example, or hosting a community gathering, you can list the kind of accommodations that have been planned for. So, like, the room is wheelchair accessible, the building is wheelchair accessible. We will have, for example, ASL interpreters or captioning or whatever else there might be. And then, of course, making sure to follow through and providing all of the things that are put out there. But that would be my response. I don't know, Emily, if you had anything to add.
No, I think that sounds about right, because accommodations can be so personal and different, and small things that you might not even think of be impossible from a employment point of view, I think, to list everything. But just really making people aware that you provide them and you encourage people to have a conversation about it that will initially be confidential. I think it's the way to go.
So Katie in the chat asks, we would like to specifically recruit volunteers with all abilities. What is the appropriate language to use to let people know we have opportunities and would like to accommodate? I think I know one of the things you'll say, which is disability, not all abilities, but you can take it from there.
Thanks, Eric. That's exactly right. I think we often feel the need to use euphemisms about disability, like all abilities or special needs, and the word disability is fine. So use the word disability, and also make sure that you list what you are offering, what kinds of opportunities you are offering to participate. Be as specific as possible so people know what you're looking for, and just use language similar to what you'll find in the webinar about events. To request accommodations, please contact name of a person, at, phone number, or email address. So specifically saying, contact Emily at this phone number or this email is a very strong signal that somebody's going to get their needs met in order to be able to fully participate as a volunteer. Risa, anything to add?
This is Risa. I would just add back to our notes about recruitment, also being intentional about where all that wonderful opportunity announcement is going. So making sure that, communities that serve and work with people with disabilities are aware of that opportunity, and taking the time to make sure that your distribution lists are as comprehensive as possible to help spread that word, as well as maintaining or building relationships.
Okay, so we have about a minute left. If anyone has any last minute questions, I would be happy to answer them. And I'm sure our speakers will be as well. But assuming there aren't any other questions, I would like to once again thank our two speakers. They were phenomenal, and thank Randy as well for introducing the webinar. And we will see you all next week, hopefully, for our next webinar. So thank you all very much for joining us today, and we will see you all soon.